My parents spent my entire life calling me the family failure. That wasn't a joke in my house. It wasn't said with a smile. It was the label that followed me everywhere. And the strange thing? Everyone believed it. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. My name is Mimi Bettler. I'm 27 years old. I grew up in a family where success had a very specific definition. My grandfather, Arthur Bettler, built Bettler Logistics from a single delivery truck into a $60 million regional shipping company. My father, Richard Bettler, spent decades running it. And my older brother Daniel, who's 31, was raised from childhood to inherit it. Family dinners sounded like board meetings. Conversations were about profits, expansion, contracts. Daniel always sat beside my dad. I usually sat quietly at the end of the table. "Daniel understands business," my father would say proudly, and then, almost like a routine punchline, "Mimi just never had that mindset. The family failure." So when my grandfather passed away and the entire family gathered for the will reading, nobody questioned what would happen next. Daniel leaned back confidently in his chair. My parents were already smiling. They thought they knew exactly who would own the company. But then the lawyer looked up from the document and said my name. Before I tell you what happened in that lawyer's office, you need to understand something. In my family, reputation was decided early. And once they gave you a role, it stuck. Daniel Bettler, my older brother, was the golden child. Even when we were kids, my father Richard treated him like a future executive. At 16, Daniel was already visiting the Bettler Logistics office after school. By 18, he was sitting quietly in real board meetings, wearing a suit that made him look older than he was. Everyone praised him. Daniel's a natural leader. He's just like his grandfather. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, the observer. I didn't interrupt conversations. I didn't argue during business debates at the dinner table. And because I wasn't loud about my ideas, my family assumed I didn't have any. So they started joking. "Mimi's the creative one. Mimi doesn't care about business." And eventually, the label became permanent. The family failure. But here's the strange part: no one in my family ever noticed. While Daniel was learning how to talk like a CEO, I was learning how the entire logistics system actually worked. In college, I studied data analytics and supply chain systems. Not flashy, not impressive sounding at family dinners, but numbers don't lie. During one summer break, I helped the company's accountant, Kevin Ortiz, review shipping data, just out of curiosity. Within a week, I spotted something odd. Several delivery routes were sending trucks back empty. It was costing the company hundreds of thousands in fuel every year. Kevin stared at my spreadsheet like he couldn't believe it. "You just saved this company about $300,000, he told me. But the funny thing? My family never heard about it. Because the one person who did hear about it was my grandfather. And what he did next would quietly change everything. About 6 months before my grandfather Arthur passed away, he called me unexpectedly. Not Daniel, me. "Come by the office tomorrow," he said calmly over the phone. "I want to show you something." Now that alone was strange. My grandfather was a quiet man, but he was extremely sharp. At 82 years old, he still reviewed company reports every week. And usually, when he wanted to talk business, he called Daniel. But that day, I walked into his office alone. Stacks of shipping reports covered his desk. Old route maps hung on the walls. The room smelled like paper, ink, and coffee that had been sitting too long. He slid a thick folder across the table. 5 years of logistics data, he said. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at me carefully. Tell me what everyone else is missing." No explanation, no instructions, just that challenge. For the next 2 weeks, I lived inside spreadsheets, fuel costs, delivery times, warehouse bottlenecks, driver schedules. And slowly, patterns started appearing. Trucks were returning empty on long routes. Warehouses were loading shipments at inefficient times. Entire regions were losing profit without anyone noticing. When I finally showed my grandfather my analysis, he read every page without saying a word. Minutes passed. Then he closed the folder and said something I still remember perfectly. Leadership isn't about who talks the loudest at the dinner table. But the strange thing? He never told anyone about those meetings. Not my father, not my brother. Which meant that when we all gathered for the will reading after his funeral, Daniel walked into that room believing the company already belonged to him. And honestly, everyone else believed it too, until the lawyer reached the final page. The will reading happened 3 days after my grandfather's funeral. We were all sitting inside a quiet conference room at Liu and Patterson law offices. Dark wooden table, tall windows, the kind of place where every sound feels louder than it should. At the head of the table sat Margaret Liu, the family lawyer, 49 years old, calm and precise. She had handled my grandfather's legal work for years. My parents sat together on one side. My father, Richard, looked tired but composed. My mother, Susan, kept glancing proudly at my brother. And Daniel? Daniel looked completely relaxed. He was 31, wearing one of his usual tailored suits, leaning slightly back in his chair like someone who already knew the ending of the story. Honestly, everyone in that room expected the same thing. Bettler Logistics would go to Daniel. Margaret Liu started reading the will. First came the personal assets, my grandfather's house, some investment accounts, a few charitable donations he had arranged. No tension yet, just routine legal language. Daniel's smile slowly grew as the document moved closer to the final section. Then Margaret Liu paused. She adjusted her glasses and turned to the last page. This section concerns the controlling ownership of Bettler Logistics. You could almost feel the anticipation in the room. Daniel straightened his jacket. My mother squeezed his arm. And then the lawyer spoke again. Per Arthur Bettler's final directive, controlling ownership of Bettler Logistics is transferred to Mimi Bettler. The room went completely silent. Daniel's smile vanished instantly, but the real shock hadn't even been explained yet. For a few seconds after the lawyer said my name, nobody spoke. The room just froze. My brother Daniel stared at Margaret Liu like he had misheard her. My father leaned forward slowly, his eyes locked on the document in her hands. Even my mother looked confused. "Excuse me?" my father finally said. Margaret Liu didn't react emotionally. She simply turned the page and continued reading from my grandfather's written statement. And that's when everything started making sense. For the past several years, she read, I have privately evaluated the leadership abilities of both of my grandchildren. Daniel shifted in his chair. Margaret continued. While Daniel has attended meetings and observed operations, Mimi has repeatedly provided detailed operational analyses that improved company performance. My brother's head slowly turned toward me. That's when Margaret explained something my family never knew. Every report I had given my grandfather, every spreadsheet, every logistics improvement, every efficiency plan had been documented, and the fuel optimization plan alone had saved the company over $300,000. My grandfather had been quietly testing us, not by who spoke the most, but by who actually improved the company. Margaret finished the final sentence my grandfather had written. Leadership belongs to the person who builds the future of this company. Then she looked up, and suddenly, for the first time in my life, my family was looking at the family failure very differently. The will reading happened 3 days after my grandfather's funeral, and if you had walked into that room, you would have thought the ending of the story was already decided. We were sitting in a quiet conference room at Liu and Patterson law offices. Dark wooden table, tall windows letting in soft afternoon light. The kind of place where even the sound of someone turning a page feels loud. Margaret Liu, the family lawyer, sat at the head of the table. She had handled my grandfather's legal work for nearly 20 years. My parents sat on one side of the table. My father, Richard, looked serious but calm. My mother, Susan, kept glancing at my brother with a proud smile. Daniel sat confidently in his chair, wearing one of his usual tailored suits. He looked exactly like someone who expected to leave that room as the new owner of Bettler Logistics. And honestly, why wouldn't he? He had been preparing for that role his entire life. I sat quietly at the far end of the table. Nobody really paid attention to me. Margaret Liu began reading the will. First came the usual things: my grandfather's house, some investment accounts, a few charitable donations he had arranged over the years. The room stayed calm. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, completely relaxed. Then Margaret turned to the final page. This final section concerns the controlling ownership of Bettler Logistics. You could almost feel the anticipation in the room. Daniel adjusted his jacket. My mother squeezed his arm proudly, but then Margaret Liu read the next sentence. Per Arthur Bettler's final directive, controlling ownership of Bettler Logistics is transferred to Mimi Bettler. Silence. Total silence. Daniel blinked. My father leaned forward slowly. My mother looked confused. And Margaret Liu calmly continued reading the explanation my grandfather had left behind. Because the truth was, this decision hadn't been sudden at all. For a few seconds after the lawyer said my name, the entire room went completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like everyone's brain is trying to catch up at the same time. My brother Daniel was the first to react. He leaned forward slowly, staring at Margaret Liu like he had misheard her. "I think there's been a mistake," he said. But Margaret Liu didn't look surprised at all. She simply adjusted the document in front of her and continued reading from the written statement my grandfather had left behind. "For several years," she read calmly, "I have privately evaluated the leadership abilities of both of my grandchildren." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Then came the line that changed the entire atmosphere in the room. Daniel attended meetings. Mimi improved the company. You could actually hear someone inhale sharply behind me. Margaret explained that every report I had shared with my grandfather had been documented. Every efficiency analysis, every operational improvement. The fuel route correction alone had saved the company nearly $300,000 in 1 year. My grandfather hadn't been impressed by speeches or confidence. He had been measuring results. Then Margaret read his final note. Leadership should belong to the person who strengthens the future of the company, not the person who assumes they deserve it. For the first time in my life, my parents looked at me without that familiar expression of disappointment. Daniel didn't say another word. And the strangest part? The family failure had just become the owner of the entire company.